Hey YouTube, Dusty here, and I'm excited to announce I have officially launched my Patreon page. If you like what I do, you can sign up for tiers like Saiyan, Super Saiyan, and Super Saiyan Rose to unlock exclusive daily content. You can also unlock unique callers for my new Discord channel. Regardless if you become a Patreon or not, make sure you stop by and say hello. Hello YouTube, how's it going? And welcome back to Kitchen Table Meta. Now, this is episode 7 of Meta Monday, the series where I take your questions or just a topic I want to talk about and go into detail and kind of go over it. Now, this is one of my favorite series to do, especially when I have a viewer question. And as it turns out this week, I do have a viewer question. And so let me read out the question real quick. I'll pop it up down here so you guys can see it. And again, hopefully I don't butcher this name. It's from James Straw, and it says, maybe you can also make a video like this on how to create a side deck and go into detail with that. And so James, that's a great question. This is a video I've kind of wanted to do anyway. And so you asking the question just definitely solidified it, and let's get into it. Again, guys, I love answering your guys' questions. And so please, if you guys ever have a question, put it down in the comment section below. I might not get to it the following week, but I'll definitely get to it as quickly as possible. And so first thing I want to talk about in this topic, and James, again, thank you, is what is a side deck? Now, this is something that's unique to certain games. Not every game has a side deck, and again, to have a side deck, normally you have to be playing in a best of 3 format. And so I just want to make that clear before we go into it for any new players that might not understand what that is. And essentially, I'm just going to read what they have listed as side decking for this game in the floor rules. If you're not familiar with the floor rules, again, I'll have the link in the description so you guys can go check them out. If you guys are ever interested in tournaments or events, it's a good read. But anyway, let me go over real quick what Bandai says a side deck is. It says, side decks refer to cards that players can use to adjust their decks between games. After the end of each game in a match, players can choose to swap cards into their deck from their side deck. Side decks can only include battle cards and extra cards. Now, this is important, guys. You can't put leaders in your side deck. I get that question a lot, and you cannot do it, unfortunately. It says the limit on the number of cards with the same name that can be included in total between the deck and side deck should follow the limits that would normally be applied for a given game. If rules or effects change the limit on the number of cards that can be included, that limit applies to total cards in both your deck and side deck. And so, for example, the meta cooler that we saw, the infinite manipulation meta cooler, what it's saying here is that normally you can only have 4 of a card in your deck or side deck. However, with that card, since it changes the rules of the game, it also applies to the side deck. So you could have all 15 of your cards being meta coolers, infinite manipulation meta coolers, if you wanted. Okay, then it says, before the start of each game, if a player has a side deck, they should present it to their opponent face down. The number of cards in side deck is public information, but a player is not required to reveal how many cards they swap to or from their side deck. So what this paragraph is saying is that, your opponent needs to know how many cards are in your side deck. Essentially, it's, you're only allowed to have up to 15 cards. And so this is a way for you to show your opponent, hey, look, I have 15 cards or 13 cards. I'm not running 20 cards or 25 cards. A lot of players will take their side deck and they'll hide them in their deck box, and they'll be like, hey, this is my side deck. And then no one knows, maybe you have 30 cards in there. Maybe you have, cards in there that aren't sleeved that maybe you just got from a friend or something. It's really, it can be very strange if you don't just show your opponent like, hey, look, I have 15 cards, 13 cards, ever how many, this is how many I have. Now, you don't have to show your opponent what you're sideboarding in. You don't have to say, hey, look, I'm taking out Jocko's for Trunks. You don't have to do anything like that. You just want to make sure your opponent knows that you're not running too many cards. It says, during a game, players are allowed to look at their side decks, but only if it's clear that those cards are separate from the ones being used from the current game. So that's a way you can say, like, oh, I want to look and see if I have an answer to this threat. So, maybe they play out like a cell or something. And you're like, oh, I don't think I have a way to deal with this guy. I wonder if I do in my sideboard. And you want to go check real quick. What I usually do in this situation is I'll just always keep my sideboard unsleeved. And that way, if I'm going through and looking at my sideboard, it's obvious that those aren't cards. Now, a lot of people, they'll sleeve their sideboard. And while that makes it easier to switch cards in and out, it does often lead to a lot of problems with not only, maybe in looking the same, but also it can possibly lead to a situation where you accidentally keep a sideboard card in your deck going into the next match, which can result in a game loss as well. So it says, before the start of the first game of each match, players must return their decks and side decks to the original states. That's actually what we just talked about. And again, so make sure, I always like to keep them separate. I always like to keep my sideboard unsleeved and my deck sleeved. So it's easy for me to go back through and say, oh, look, I have some of these cards that are in my main deck. I need to figure out where that sideboard card is in my deck so I can switch it out. And then lastly, it says, if a player receives a game loss penalty prior to the start of the first game of a match, players are not allowed to switch cards out from their side decks before the start of game 2. To me, this is actually a pretty terrible ruling. Normally what happens if you would happen to get a game loss, like maybe you're late to a game or something will cause you to get a game loss on the first game, you just essentially treat that as if your opponent won the game, and then you just go right into game 2 with your opponent winning, so then you would sideboard and then continue. I don't understand necessarily why this rule's like this. To me, that's fine. It doesn't make that much sense to me, but I guess in reality it doesn't make too much sense unless it's like a top 8 situation where you actually know what you're playing. For example, if I'm going into game 2, I probably won't sideboard anyway if I don't know what my opponent's playing. But if I'm in top 8 and I know my opponent's playing Cell, then I would want the sideboard. So it's kind of a weird ruling, something that I could see possibly getting changed in the future, but currently that's how it stands. All right, so that's the rules about what sideboarding are, and it goes over the stuff. Some quick things I want to talk about, guys. Remember, you cannot sideboard in a leader card, and this is important. I think it's a very good rule because I think it would just make the game too random if you could. If you're sitting down, your opponent's playing Vegeta, and you're like, okay, here we go. I'm going to sideboard in. I have this really good plan against Vegeta, hand destruction. I know how to beat this. I'm going to do it, and you start sideboarding, and then you go into your next game, and your opponent's like, haha, I'm playing Cell now, and you're like, okay, cool. This is completely different. I think that's kind of unfun, and while it might be like a neat side format or something, I think it's probably a pretty terrible rule to have in a competitive environment. Next up, I want to say that you cannot you can have callers in your side deck that aren't in your main deck. And so what I mean by that is, like, if you're running like a blue-red Champa, you can put yellow cards in your sideboard. You're more than welcome to do that. I've seen a lot of people do this where they'll make a blue-red deck and then they'll sideboard into like a blue-yellow deck. I think that can be a pretty cool strategy. I just want to let you guys know that's something that you can do. And then last, the thing I want to talk about is, remember that these are only usable guys after game 1. So you have to be in a best-of-3 format, and you have to have lost. No, I'm sorry, lost. What the heck am I talking about? You have to wait until after someone has won or lost the first game to then sideboard in for the second and third game. Okay, so the next thing I want to talk about, and this goes more about how do we build a good sideboard, how do we make a sideboard that can win. And how we do this is we want to make sure that we know the meta. Now, this is extremely important with almost anything, but in sideboarding it's even more important, because a lot of the times if you build a deck and you don't know the meta, sometimes you can just win. Sometimes you have a good start, or maybe your deck just naturally counters your opponent's deck and you can win. But in my opinion, if you don't know the meta, it's hard to build a good sideboard. It's very difficult. And so the first thing I want to talk about, guys, and this is by far the most important thing that I'll talk about in this video, and that is make sure you know your local meta when building a sideboard. If your local meta does best of 3s and allows sideboarding, from now on we're just going to assume that's the case, then you need to make sure you understand the local meta, because I've seen a lot of players, and again, this is by far, in my opinion, the biggest mistake new players make, and they'll build a deck, or they'll go and they'll net deck, they'll get a deck out off the internet, which, by the way, there's nothing wrong with, and they'll just copy and paste the sideboard, right? And then they'll go to an event, their local event, and they'll start losing, and they'll start being like, I don't know what the sideboard, this sideboard doesn't seem good enough to me, and they'll lose. And the reason why is because sideboards are a way to enhance matchups that you think you're weak at, but more importantly, that you know that you'll be playing against, right? And so whenever we go into a big event like regionals or something, we usually build sideboards based on the top decks that we think will be there, which I'll talk about here in a second. But when you go into a local meta, you want to build a sideboard against the players that you know that you're going to play. If I go to a local meta and I know Chris is going to be playing Vegito, he's the Vegito player in our meta, he loves that deck, then I need to make sure I have a plan against Vegito. My buddy John plays Zamasu, he loves that deck. I need to know and make sure I have a plan against Zamasu, even if those decks aren't popular in the actual meta, right? Just because Tricolor Ginyu is one of the best decks in the format doesn't mean people at my meta or my locals play that deck. And so me having a sideboard plan against that deck doesn't help me at all if no one actually plays it. And so just make sure you go, what, Timmy likes to play ramp, so you need to have an idea how to beat ramp, because Timmy's going to be there, Timmy's going to be playing ramp, so you need to have a way to beat that. So that's by far the best advice I can give you guys, is make sure that your sideboard changes from event to event. Make sure that you know what you're playing against and have a plan against it. Next thing is, again, I said it, but I'll definitely emphasize it here, is that you play more games at your locals, guys. So make sure that those are, start out to be your sideboard plan. You can adjust it when you go to regionals once a month, but make sure, every Thursday or every Saturday when you go to your locals that you have an idea for your sideboard. Okay, next thing I want to talk about with knowing the meta is note what decks are popular and have a plan against them. And so if you're struggling with your sideboard, if you're like, I have like 6 or 7 slots left over, I have the cards that beat Chris in here, I have the cards that beat John in here, but I have a couple more slots. What can I do? What can I put in here? A lot of players will just take random cards, will throw them in there, which can be fine. Just maybe you have some strong cards you might want in there, maybe the 4th Beerus, or maybe some more ramp in case you think you might need that. But what I suggest doing is really knowing what popular decks are and have a plan against them, either in the main deck or the sideboard. And so, for example, we know Hand Destruction is a very, very powerful deck and something that's very popular. I almost always run into Hand Destruction decks when I go to events, and so we need to have a plan against that. If we don't have one in the main deck, we need to make sure we have one in the sideboard deck. And the best way to beat that deck is to have a way to awaken. And so, maybe in the main board, you don't have room for, a way to awaken. Maybe you have a different strategy. But make sure if you're worried about Hand Destruction that you throw a couple Resolve Trainings in your sideboard, or you throw a Furious Hail Vegeta in there, or a TN. Just throw something in there that gives you a way to awaken. With the Tricolor Ginyu deck, they really kind of win their games based on Cold Bloodlust. So just make sure you have a way to deal with Cold Bloodlust. Throw some indestructible threats in your sideboard. So throw some threats in there that's are still good even if they get Cold Bloodlusted, and just have a way around it. Just be prepared for that. Also, Cell is another good deck that we can expect to see a lot of. And a good way to stop that is just make sure you have a way to stop their combo, their Cell combo, which is they play the 3-drop out, then they put 17 under there, then they go get their 5-drop, puts 18 under, and then they go get their 7-drop and discard your hand. That's a huge combo. The androids can do that, Cell can do that. Just have a plan against it. Have something to be able to kill it when they attack. Have a Mafuba, have the green counter. Just have something to deal with it. Also, and again, another big popular deck is the Vegeta aggro deck. Just make sure you have some negates. Make sure you have some blockers. The yellow blocker is a very good blocker against the Vegeta aggro deck. So just make sure, again, you have a plan for that. And lastly, the last deck I'll talk about is Zamasu. Very important deck, very popular deck. Make sure you have a Mafuba or Energy Destruction, some way to either deal with his indestructible threats, or have a way to stop him from ramping up to his big threat. And again, guys, remember, in this game, and this is another really big tip, in this game, you draw a lot of cards. You draw a lot more cards in this game than you ever did in Magic or any of those other games, and so you don't need, 4 of an answer in your sideboard very, very frequently. And so what I mean by that is, in Magic, a lot of times your sideboard cards were extremely important, and you had to have a lot of them. You had to have 4 of them because you needed to make sure you got it on turn 2. With this game, since you're drawing like sometimes 2, 3, 4 cards a turn, you can go with 3 of a card to open up more slots to protect you and make you stronger against other matchups. So just remember that. This game is a lot more consistent, and so take advantage of that in the sideboard. Open up some slots in that. Next up, guys, is probably the biggest mistake that I see competitive players make, and that is you need to play more games with your sideboard. I've seen so many competitive players make this mistake and actually even get mad about this. And so what I mean by this is that in a best of 3 scenario, right? Chances are, if it goes to 3 games, right? Let's pretend like you play a best of 3 format, all of your games go to best of 3. Then you will have played more games with the sideboard than you did with your main board, right? And so because of that, you need to make sure that you're playtesting with your sideboard. I've seen a lot of players sit down, they'll start playing their cards out, they'll play a couple games, they'll play 3 or 4 games with sideboards, without sideboards, and then somebody will go, hey, let's try sideboards. And then their opponent will be like, no, that's not fair. Like, you know what deck I'm playing now. You'll just beat me. You'll sideboard in. You'll put these threats in, and I won't be able to win as easily. So, this isn't fair. I don't want to play like this. Which always blew me away. It's like, yeah, but like when you go to an event, right? Like, they're going to be able to do that. And so you should really have an idea of how to be, if your deck can win every single game 1, but then loses every single game after sideboarding, then you probably aren't playing a good deck. So you either need to have a sideboard deck that can beat that, or just play a different deck. And what stinks is a lot of players play decks like that, and then they refuse to test with sideboarding, and then when they get to events, they get blown out in the sideboard phase, and they get mad. They're like, this sucks, like I had a bad luck, or something bad happened, or my opponent was super lucky, or he always drew that sideboard card, and they always blame on everything else, except their just, inability to just test with the sideboard. And so make sure, guys, that you're testing with your sideboard, you're playing more games with the sideboard, because that is, in theory, you'll play more games, with the sideboard. Next up is, don't copy someone's sideboard without testing. I see this all the time. I see people will copy and paste someone's deck, which is fine. That's great. That's a good way to get into the game. That's a good way to play the game. But then they'll copy and paste the sideboard, and I hate that because I think that the sideboard is like almost like your personal touch to the deck. Right, it's your plan. It's your unique game plan. Your coach's handbook with how you're going to play. The deck. And so a lot of times people's sideboarding plans aren't clear. Sometimes people put like maybe only 8 cards in the sideboard that they want, and then they'll just throw other cards in there just in case. And so players will play those cards in their deck, not realizing that those cards just aren't significant in any way. And so what I suggest is to go ahead and have the list of sideboard cards beside you. But then when you're playing with a friend or playtesting or playing on Octagon or whatever, that you try out the sideboard and then see, you know what, like I said, always have that list beside you. And when you're playing against maybe a cell deck, be like, oh, okay, I see why this Mafuba's in here, because it allows me to, essentially stop this cell, and it buys me time so I can get Beerus to kill it. Or, oh, I see why they have Jocko's in the sideboard, because it's really, really good against Tien, or it's really good against the Vegeta matchup. I get it now. I'll keep those in. And if after 5 or 6 games you can't understand why some of those cards are in there, ask friends, definitely, figure it out. But if you can't, just remove them and put new cards in that you understand, that you have a plan. Again, guys, the sideboard is your personal touch to the deck, and it's your plan of how you're going to deal with certain situations. So make sure that you take the time to review it and go over it. Don't just copy and paste it, because in that point, you probably just shouldn't play with the sideboard anyway, because if you don't know why the cards are there, then you're not going to be able to take advantage of it and really take advantage of playing with the sideboard. And again, also, don't be afraid to change the sideboard plan if it doesn't fit your playstyle. There was a deck I saw that it was a blue mono blue Vegeta deck, aggro deck, and they sideboarded into a red deck, a blue red deck, and I was like, I hate that, and I just scrapped it. I was like, I'm not doing that. I don't like to play the red cards. I think it makes the deck clunky. I'm just not doing that, and I was like, nope, sorry, not doing it. While my friend loved that and kept it and played it, and we play tested around it, and it really fit his play style. Neither one of us was right or wrong. It's just one of the sideboard plan fit his play style, but it didn't fit mine, so I cut it. So don't be afraid to do that, guys. Again, it's a personal touch for you. And so the last thing I want to talk about, guys, before I get out of here is, and this is something that I wanted to make a whole video about, but I'm just going to quickly go through it because it could be a little ranty, and I really hope that it doesn't come across that way. It's just something that I really want to kind of bring home and let you guys know about. And that is, most of the time, and that is like, again, a very vague descriptor, but most of the time, sideboarding is bad for a game. And so I see it all the time in the forums. I see it all the time in the Facebook groups. I see people say that, like, we have to have sideboarding in this game or it's bad. And I really feel like, guys, and this is coming from my game design background, it comes from my opinion, is that a lot of game imbalance can always be backtracked to sideboarding. And so a lot of times what happens is that essentially players there'll be like 2 or 3 decks that's really good. So let's take Tricolor Ginyu, for example. That deck is extremely good. It's very fun to play, if you like that kind of style. That deck has a potential to be extremely busted in a sideboarding format because it runs 3 callers. I'll put this over here. Since it runs 3 callers, it can really make a very oppressive sideboard that can have answers to everything. And you do not want decks in card games to have an answer to everything. That's what makes it balanced, right? If you have a deck that can do everything, then everybody would just play that deck. And what happens is you'll have everybody playing that deck, and then maybe everybody playing one other deck that can beat that deck or have a good matchup against that deck, and it crushes the meta down to only be like 2 or 3 decks, which happens a lot of the time in Magic. It's especially in standard Magic, because there's not enough cards to really create a very diverse meta. Now, this doesn't always happen, guys. This is just something that can happen. It's just like essentially, it's not me saying that this is what's going to happen in this game. I actually think sideboarding in this game is fine. In this game so far, there hasn't been those silver bullet cards that just shut down decks. There's not a card that says something like, if your leader's green, kill 2 of their guys. And then everyone's like, well, I'm playing against Cell, I'll just play 4 of those guys and just wreck them. In Magic, we have a lot of that hate where it's like, if your opponent has a red card, this happens, or protection to red cards or stuff like that, which can do it. So I'm not saying this is going to happen. It's just something that can happen. I see a lot of people say this, and this is something I'm going to say right now. I see a lot of people saying that sideboarding is super skillful and it's the most skillful thing you can do in the game. That's absolutely not true, guys. The most skillful thing you can do in this game is just playing the game properly, not making play mistakes, and playing as smoothly and as accurate as possible. Sideboarding often comes down to just having a plan against your opponent and then just remembering that plan and doing it. It's just like a mechanical thing eventually. You'll come down to be like, oh, when I play against Cell, I do this. When I play against Zamasu, I do this. It's not necessarily skillful after you figured it out, but playing the game is a very dynamic and skillful thing and will always be the most skillful thing you can do in the game. The last thing I'll talk about in the sideboard is this can confuse new players and intimidate them into coming into the game because they don't always understand what it is. They also feel like it's, you know, big deal. They have to have a super plan. They have to have all 15 cards. If they don't, it can confuse them. So to all the new players, if you don't have a sideboard or don't know how to sideboard, ask your friends, ask the local players if they'll help you. If they won't, then just play without a sideboard. That's fine. You can still play the game. You can still win games without a sideboard, guys. Please don't let it intimidate you and just jump in. Also, guys, if you ever have any questions about the sideboard, just let me know down in the comment section below, and I'll be happy to help you. All right, guys, so that's it for Meta Monday number 7. Real quick before we get out of here, I want to remind you guys that I did launch my Patreon page. I'll have daily unique I guess exclusive content on that page. Also, I launched my Discord page as well, so you guys can jump in there, ask me questions. I'll try to always be in there daily. I'll be up in a little Super Saiyan channel, so if you guys want to talk to me, we can always talk. We can play some Octagon games. Again, I'm really trying to create a community that can, you know, help new players learn the game, but also give us a way to talk about different decks and stuff too. And so I thought Discord would be a perfect opportunity to do that. So guys, thank you so much again for watching. Thank you again, James, with the awesome question. I loved it. I love talking about this stuff. It's just one of the funnest things for me to do. So if you guys have any questions about what I should do for the next Meta Monday, let me know in the comments section below. I hope you guys have a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful Monday, and we'll see you next time.